And the first lesson is this. It's that adverse conditions create the environment for compromise. Genesis 12 and verse 10. There was a famine in the land. There was a famine in the land. Now, most of us do not have any experience with famine. Zero. We have sort of the opposite problem in our society today. We have plenty of food, so that we waste a lot of it. We do not understand famine. But in the ancient world, it's an agricultural world. Famine means what? Well, presumably, there's no rain, and so there's no grain, there's no food for animals or humans, and people get hungry. Have you ever been hungry? And I don't mean like hangry, grouchy. We've never experienced this. Abram sees that there's famine in the land, so Abram, what does he do? Well, by all accounts, when you read Genesis 12:9, he's basically just arriving in Canaan. He's just traveling. And it's almost like in the next breath, he decides to leave Canaan, leave the land of promise, and go down to Egypt to sojourn there. That means like extended road trip, extended vacation. But it's not a vacation because it's the ancient world and things are difficult. For the famine was severe in the land. So Abram leaves. Now, is this a bad thing on Abram's part, do you think? Is it wrong to leave Canaan and go to Egypt? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The act of leaving Canaan because of famine is actually a recurring theme in the Old Testament. Isaac, Abram's son, will one day also leave Canaan. He doesn't go to Egypt, he goes to Gerar. Genesis chapter 26 in verse 1, there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. Remember that one? Genesis 12 verse 10. And so Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and he said, do not go down to Egypt. Don't go down to Egypt. Now you might argue because Abraham went down to Egypt and it did not turn out well. So Isaac, Abram's son, don't go down to Egypt. And he tells him, Jacob, you will maybe remember if you're familiar with the story of Genesis, Jacob later went to Egypt due to a famine. Now that was after one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, and we'll go through this story later. It's a wild story, but he's sold by his siblings into slavery. And once again, we don't understand sibling rivalry. We don't get it. And he ends up in Egypt, and God blesses him and all these things. Well, later, Joseph's occupying a very high place in Egypt, and Jacob and his whole family, same reason. There's a famine, and they leave Canaan, and they go to Egypt. Of course, in the book of Ruth, we preached through the book of Ruth, what was that, 2 years ago now, and in the book of Ruth, Elimelech is the kind of introductory character there, and Elimelech leaves with Naomi, his wife, because there's a famine in Israel, in the land of promise. And he goes into Moab, and there's the story of Ruth. So there's this recurring theme, and there's nothing explicit in Genesis 12 to tell us that Abraham is in sin because he left Canaan due to the famine. But at the same time, there are clues that Abram's not acting in good faith. He's leaving Canaan, he's going to Egypt. Is that intrinsically sinful? Not necessarily, but it becomes quickly apparent in the story that Abram does not trust God. And you might even then say that Abram's going to Egypt because of that. If you look at the regions of the Middle East, or the ancient Near East, we might say here, for Israel / at this point known as Canaan and Egypt, Canaan did not have a major river running through it. And so the land of Canaan, very fertile land, but totally dependent on rainfall to water crops. Yes? Totally. There's not irrigation. There's not modern irrigation. So it's rainfall. By contrast, what is there in Egypt? The Nile, the mighty Nile River. And so Egypt, for a substantial section of it, had an extraordinarily fertile area that was, you might say, more reliable and secure than the land of Canaan. Although, later in Genesis, when Joseph is in Egypt, there is a famine, not just in Canaan, but in Egypt. And the Nile River itself was so diminished in its capacity that people in Egypt were not able to grow crops. Now, why do I say all of this? Because Abram, I think, has a literal case of the grass is greener over there. There's a famine in Canaan, and there's the Nile in Egypt. And by comparison, Egypt presents a drastically more secure-looking alternative for Abraham to live in. Now, in the big picture of biblical theology, who is the creator of heaven and earth? Yahweh God is. And so, whose hand is crop success ultimately in? God's hand. Whether you are in Canaan waiting for rain, or whether you are in Egypt and relying on the Nile River. But if you're not thinking of that, if you're not thinking of it's by God's hand that crops grow, if you're not dwelling on that fact, then Egypt looks a lot better than Canaan. And there's no indication here in Genesis 12 that Abram seeks God's guidance at all. That's what I'm saying. There's clues in the text. Is it sinful to go to Egypt? Not necessarily. But when Abram does not even ask God, and he goes to the place that by all accounts appears to be a lot more secure and a lot more reliable, and then that's followed by a story where Abram has an increasing deceit that he's willing to employ for self-preservation, it begins to look a lot like, again, Abram's not acting in good faith. And I think it's fair to suggest that Abram left Canaan because famine caused him to question God's providence. The famine, it's not that it's sinful for Abram to be worried, it's that the famine creates an environment in which it's totally possible to question God's faithfulness. An environment in which that lack of faith is totally able to thrive and fester and grow. It's an environment in which Abram ended up deciding that it was best to take matters into his own hands because God's not going to help me. Now, what do we do with that then? Let me suggest this to you. We don't know what famine's like, but we know what disappointment is like. We know what adversity is like. We know what it's like. I suspect any of you know what it's like to enter a season or situation in which it looks like it might be the case that God does not care about you. Adversity is a place, it's an environment in which it might be strongly tempting for you to believe that God does not care about me and He will not help me. Now, it's not the place where that's guaranteed to happen. It's not wrong to be in a famine. It's not wrong to be in adversity. It's not wrong to experience hardship. I think of when Jesus encounters a man who was born blind. And his disciples, they have some assumptions about what that means, right? So they ask him, well, whose sin caused that particular malady? His sin? Is he blind because of his sin, or is he blind because of his parents' sin? And what did Jesus say to him? Neither. But this is that the glory of God might be displayed in this man. So adversity is not itself any kind of indication that you're wicked, that you're sinful, but it is an environment where one of two things is possible. It is a place for either deeper faith or faithless self-reliance.